Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a trip back to the 1970s.
The 70s, a time of platform shoes, disco, and, well,
A pretty intense push for a new global economic order.
yeah. It was a time of massive change, especially on the world stage. Think newly independent nations, many former colonies, really flexing their muscles, saying, hey, the old ways, they aren't going to cut it anymore.
That's what this whole new international economic order, the NIEO, was all about, right?
Yeah.
Trying to rewrite the rules of the game.
Exactly. It was a bold vision. Imagine a world where trade, finance, even how we control natural resources, all of it, decided not by, the ghosts of colonialism, but by a genuine partnership between developed and developing nations.
A complete power shift.
Yeah.
And to unpack all of this, we've got a stack of books and articles from some leading scholars on this topic.
And believe me, these sources don't hold back. They give you a front row seat to all the drama, the big debates, the lasting impact of the NIEO.
So let's set the stage a bit. We're talking about the 1970s. What made this period so ripe for such a radical idea like the NIEO to emerge?
Think about it, the Bretton Woods system, which had been the bedrock of international finance since World War II, it collapses.
Not exactly a minor event.
Not at all. And on top of that, you've got the oil crisis throwing the global economy into a tailspin.
Recipe for disaster, or at least major upheaval.
Exactly. And amidst all this, you have all these newly independent nations, many of them former colonies, realizing that the global playing field is far from level. They're looking around and saying, hey, we're free from colonial rule, but the system itself is still rigged against us.
So a perfect storm of factors converging. But this wasn't just a spontaneous outburst, right? This demand for a new economic order, it had deeper roots.
Absolutely. You can trace the roots back to earlier movements, particularly the 1955 Bandung Conference.
Bandung. Refresh your memory.
Right. So this was a major gathering in Indonesia, brought together dozens of Asian and African nations, many newly independent, and their goal was clear: to challenge colonialism in all its forms and chart a course towards a more just world order.
So Bandung was like the opening act, and the NIEO was the main event a couple of decades later.
You could say that. And a lot of the intellectual firepower behind the NIEO came from thinkers like Raoul Prebisch.
Now, he was a pretty influential economist, right?
Hugely. He really captured the frustrations of the developing world. One of his most famous ideas was this concept of deteriorating terms of trade.
Deteriorating terms of trade. Break that down for us.
Basically, he was saying that the system was set up in a way that was inherently unfair to countries that primarily exported raw materials, like, say, coffee beans or copper.
Because those are what a lot of developing countries were producing at that time.
Exactly. And Prebisch argued that the prices of those raw materials were constantly declining relative to the manufactured goods, like machinery and technology, that those developing countries needed to import. So they were caught in this vicious cycle, export more and more, just to try and keep up.
It's like running on a treadmill that's going twice as fast as you can handle. You're putting in the effort, but you're not getting anywhere.
A perfect analogy. And it left developing countries feeling like they were stuck as suppliers of raw materials, with little hope of industrializing or truly developing their economies.
No wonder they were calling for a new economic order. And one term that kept popping up in our research was neocolonialism. How did that play into all of this?
Neocolonialism. This is key. It's the idea that even though many former colonies had achieved political independence, they were still trapped in these economically exploitative relationships with their former rulers.
So it's like the puppet master might have cut the strings, but the puppet is still dancing to their tune.
Precisely. The NIEO was about more than just getting a bigger slice of the pie. It was about baking a whole new pie altogether.
So we left off talking about neocolonialism, this idea that the system itself was rigged, even after the end of formal colonial rule. Big question is, how did the major powers, especially the United States, react to this whole NIEO movement?
Well, it's safe to say it didn't exactly spark joy in Washington.
I can imagine. Talk about a challenge to the established order.
It was a huge deal. I mean, here you have developing countries basically saying, we're not playing by your rules anymore. We're demanding a seat at the table where the real decisions are made.
And the U.S. being, well, the U.S. probably wasn't too keen on sharing that power.
No, not really. It was a tricky situation. They couldn't just ignore these demands too much at stake, but they also weren't about to just hand over control of the global economy.
A delicate dance, then.
Yeah.
Had to find a way to manage those demands without rocking the boat too much.
Exactly. And that's where Henry Kissinger comes in. He was Secretary of State at the time, and he came up with what he called his Southern Strategy.
Not the same as the one we usually hear about in American politics, right?
Yeah.
Right, totally different. Think of it more as a way to, how do I put this, to strategically engage with the developing world without actually changing the underlying power dynamics.
Okay, so how did that play out in practice? What were some of the tools in Kissinger's toolbox?
Well, one of the big ones was foreign aid, especially food aid.
Because let's be honest, the U.S. had plenty of food to spare.
Exactly. And they used it strategically. Food shortages were a major issue in many developing countries, so the U.S. swoops in with shipments of wheat, rice, you name it. It was a way to build goodwill, to show they were listening, without actually giving up any real power.
So classic carrot and stick, except without the stick, or at least not as much of one. But I imagine there were some strings attached to this aid.
Oh, absolutely. The Cold War was in full swing, remember? And the U.S. was really worried about developing countries cozying up to the Soviet Union. So this aid was a way to keep them in their sphere of influence.
Speaking of influence, one of the sources we looked at, North-South, the United States responds to the new international economic order, really gets into the nitty-gritty of Kissinger's approach. It argues that he was basically playing a high-stakes game, trying to placate the developing world just enough to prevent a complete overhaul of the system. Did he succeed?
Well, it worked for a while, but it was kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. The NIEO was about addressing deep-seated inequalities, and Kissinger's strategy was more about managing those demands than actually solving the underlying problems.
So it was only a matter of time before those Band-Aids started peeling off. Was there a specific turning point where this strategy started to unravel?
I'd say the World Bank became a major flashpoint.
Really? That's surprising. You'd think an institution like the World Bank, which is supposed to be focused on development, would be on board with the NIEO's goals.
You'd think so, right? But here's the thing. The World Bank, even with all its talk about helping developing countries, was still very much a product of the existing system, a system that many developing countries saw as inherently unfair.
So they're looking to the World Bank for solutions, and what do they find?
More of the same. Developing countries started to get this sinking feeling that the World Bank was more interested in maintaining the status quo than in actually changing it.
Like they were just tinkering around the edges of the problem instead of tackling it head on.
Exactly, and this created a huge crisis of legitimacy for the World Bank. One of our sources, the World Bank and the new International Economic Order, really digs into this.
Yeah, it talks about how the World Bank, in the eyes of many developing countries, basically became the rich country's substitute for the NIEO. Like, we'll give you a little aid here, a little loan there, but don't even think about asking for real change. You know, it's a shame, really. These countries, they finally break free from colonial rule. They come to the table with this bold vision for a fairer world, and the powers that be just kind of drag their feet.
It's a familiar story, sadly. Power concedes nothing without a demand, right? But even though the NIEO faced a serious uphill battle, and yeah, it didn't achieve everything on its wish list, writing it off as a failure, that's a mistake.
Okay, I'm listening. How can we say it wasn't a failure when, well, the World Economic Order is what it is today?
Because sometimes planting a seed is a victory in itself.
I like that.
Mm.
So what seeds did the NIEO plant? What kind of lasting impact did it have?
For one thing, it completely changed the conversation. Before the NIEO, issues like global economic justice, the after effects of colonialism, they weren't exactly front-page news. The NIEO dragged them into the spotlight, forced the world to pay attention.
So even if it didn't dismantle the system, it gave it a shake, made people see its cracks.
Exactly. And from those cracks, new ideas emerged. One of the most important was this concept of a right to development.
Right to development. Now that has a ring to it.
Right. It goes beyond just economic growth, talking of creating a world where everyone has a shot at a decent life, at reaching their full potential.
So not just about making sure countries have more money, but about making sure that money translates into a better life for everyone.
Exactly. And this right to development idea, it took root, influenced international law, development policies, even the way organizations like the UN operate.
It's like the NIEO was saying, don't just help us develop or recognize that we have a right to develop on our own terms.
Absolutely. And another area where the NIEO had a lasting impact was in how we think about multinational corporations.
Ah, yes, those massive companies, often seen as the beneficiaries of an unequal system.
Right. The NIEO was pretty vocal about the need to regulate those corporations to make sure they were contributing to development, not exploiting it. And that sparked a lot of important conversations about corporate responsibility that continue to this day.
So like holding corporations accountable for their actions, making sure they're not just chasing profits at the expense of people and the planet.
Exactly. And all of that fair trade, ethical consumption, sustainable development, you can draw a line from those movements right back to the ideas and the energy of the NIEO.
It's amazing how ideas that might have seemed radical back then, well, they're not so radical anymore.
That's the power of pushing for change, even when the odds are stacked against you. The NIEO reminds us that even if you don't win every battle, the very act of fighting can shift the terrain, plant the seeds for future progress.
And those seeds can blossom in unexpected ways.
Yeah.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this story?
I'd say remember that creating a more just world, it's a marathon, not a sprint. There will be setbacks, there will be moments of doubt, but the pursuit itself is what matters.
Never give up on the fight for a better world, even when it feels like an uphill battle.
Exactly. The NIUO might not have achieved all its goals, but it reminds us that even in the face of immense power, hope, and the demand for justice can leave a lasting mark.
A powerful message to end on. Thanks for joining us on this journey back to the era of the new international economic order. It's a reminder that the past is never truly past, that the echoes of these struggles continue to shape the world we live in today.
And who knows, maybe they'll even inspire us to create a more just and equitable future.
Here's hoping. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.